This conference will now be recorded.
All right, thank you for joining us. My name is Erin Davis. I'm the Director of Janesville Mobilizing for Change, or JM4C. JM4C is a youth alcohol and substance misuse prevention coalition, which the City of Janesville acts as fiscal agent for. We are overseen by the Hedberg Public Library Director, Brian McCormick. Today I have with me Julia Sherman, the Outreach Specialist for the University of Wisconsin Alcohol Policy Project. Julia began her work on alcohol policy at the American Medical Association in the Office of Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse. She was Communications Director for Reducing Underage Drinking Through Coalitions, an AMA-funded project by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. She later served as the first National Field Director for the Center of Alcohol Marketing and Youth, a project that conducted early measurements of youth exposure to alcohol advertising. Julia's work focused on determining what policies and practices at the state and local level would reduce youth exposure to alcohol advertising. After returning to Wisconsin, Julia chaired the Alcohol, Culture, and Environment Work Group of the Wisconsin State Council on Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse and authored its final report, Changing Wisconsin's Alcohol Environment to Promote Safe and Healthy Lives, which led to the creation of the Wisconsin Alcohol Policy Project in 2010. So today, Julia will be presenting on alcohol policy for local elected officials. During the presentation, I am going to place everyone on mute, but feel free to type questions in the chat box. So welcome, Julia.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you very much. And thank all of you for taking time out of an unusually beautiful and sunny day to learn about alcohol policy in Wisconsin. Let's see. Erin, you need to give me control of the slides.
Oh, you're the presenter. You should have control.
Okay, then let's see here. There we go. Thank you, I do. All righty. So today is part one. And we're going to be looking at an overview to get some context on alcohol policy, look at Wisconsin's alcohol policy framework, and then alcohol licensing in Wisconsin. Part two of this series is about the same length, a little less than an hour, and we will be talking about the policies and practices outside of licensing that also play a big role in our community alcohol environment and how to implement them. A lot of us have seem to believe, it sort of appears to be everywhere, that Wisconsin has a hostile alcohol environment, and it's always had a hostile alcohol environment. But the truth is, that isn't true. Wisconsin was just as conflicted as the rest of the nation over time in the 19th and early 20th century about alcohol. As you'll see with these newspaper clips, Wisconsin actually had a thriving temperance group in the state long before we had a commercial brewery, any commercial brewery. And by the time the Prohibition Amendment came to a vote in Wisconsin, 75% of the territory and close to half of the people in Wisconsin had already voted themselves dry. And it didn't end after Prohibition. The temperance movement, moderation, kept going on. As a matter of fact, the far picture on this slide is the United Temperance Movement's stand at the 1964 Wisconsin State Fair. So Wisconsin has always been conflicted about alcohol. We've had a number of different theories and approaches and concerns about alcohol and overconsumption of alcohol, but one thing has remained consistent: local alcohol control. Local alcohol control in Wisconsin was actually created by our territorial legislature, not our state legislature. And that turns out to be the saving grace for people that are local elected officials today. And here's why. Over the years, people at first thought that excessive alcohol use was a moral issue, and then it was a medical issue. But now medical, social, political, and just statistical research has shown that, in fact, there are aspects of our built environment that can encourage people to drink unintentionally. We've learned that there are pressure points of alcohol, and in Wisconsin, we identify them just as a memory technique by words that begin with A. First is the availability of alcohol. That makes sense. The second is the attractiveness. That's the word we use for marketing. The third is the acceptability of alcohol. And then finally is the affordability of alcohol. They're called the 4As. They don't use these words all over the world, but the World Health Organization and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the US, they use the concepts that stand behind them. Now, the one at the bottom, affordable, that's in italics because local elected officials have very little control over that. But the one at top, availability, you have an extraordinary amount of control over that here in Wisconsin, especially as a local elected official. In states that are called control states, it's not uncommon that you have to take a plane to the state capital if you have a problem. You got a problem with the bar in Cleveland, Ohio, you better find out how to get to Columbus. If you're in the Central Valley of California, better book a flight to Sacramento. Now, those sorts of things are just incomprehensible to us in Wisconsin because we have local licensing. It's a real unusual point of alcohol policy in Wisconsin, and we can use it to great benefit. The availability of alcohol is an extraordinary factor in the community alcohol environment. And that comes back to licensing locations to sell and serve alcohol. Wisconsin law provides the foundation. They set the floor in statute, but they allow communities basically to build a framework for how they want to award alcohol licenses that, in fact, reflect the alcohol environment and the community they're trying to build. The state quota only applies to locations that are selling beer, wine, and spirits. And there's no state limit on the number of off-premises location. But in Janesville, you've decided to adopt a quota of one license for every 3,500 people. That makes a lot of sense. There are different types of alcohol license. These are the two major ones, Class A and Class B. Class A, people can remember it by Drink It Away. It talks about places like grocery stores, liquor stores, convenience stores, general category. If you buy it there but you drink it elsewhere, it's a Class A. If you look at where the quotation marks are around the letter, that tells you what kind of beverages you can drink there. When it's around the letter, it means it's fermented malt beverages. That means beer, but it also means things like White Claw, the hard seltzers, the hard teas, things like that. When the quotation marks are around the entire phrase, then they can also sell spirits and wine. You have to have the separate licenses. You must hold a Class A fermented malt beverage license to hold a Class A spirits and wine license. Same thing with Class B. A lot of people think that means bars. It's a good example, but Class B licenses actually apply to any place where you drink the alcohol at the same location where you've purchased it. So it would be a bar, a restaurant, a tavern, a club. And once again, you see where the quotation marks are, and they're not in red any place but on this slide. It means the fermented malt beverages, and then when it's around the entire title, it means the spirits and wine. You may have heard the phrase Class B combination license. There's no such thing. The vote is combined, not the two licenses. Even those locations actually are awarded the two Class B licenses, one for fermented malt beverage and then one for wine and spirits. If you remember nothing else from today, remember this. There is no right to an alcohol license in Wisconsin. A municipality can deny a new applicant for any reason that is not arbitrary or discriminatory. And by discriminatory, we don't mean protected classes. What we mean is discrimination. If you say you're not going to award licenses to short people, that would be a discriminatory reason to deny me a license. If you said that you weren't going to award a license on a day where it was sunny or a day that it didn't rain, that would be pretty arbitrary. But the reason for the denial must always be provided to the licensee in writing. But think about that. There is no right to an alcohol license in Wisconsin. When an applicant comes to you, you are under no obligation to give them that license, but the reasons you want to deny it cannot be arbitrary or discriminatory. And the reason this is so important is because outlet density is a relatively new concept. It's about 25, 30 years old, and it's based on the number of licensed locations selling and serving alcohol within a defined area. Within a compact area, a very compact area, it's usually called a cluster. But when outlet density is the number of licenses selling and serving alcohol within a defined area. That's important because high levels of outlet density will increase alcohol-related crime and disorder in that area, even if every licensee obeys the law. Hold on to that thought. This is why it's important. Once awarded, an alcohol license can only be revoked, suspended, or non-renewed for cause. Yet your alcohol-related crime and disorder will increase even if all the licensees are compliant. That leaves communities with very few options for reducing outlet density. There are some options, but they are limited and they take a time. High concentrations of alcohol outlets are very expensive for a community. As you can see on this slide, binge drinking alone, and that's just binge drinking by people age 18 and older, costs government units within Rock County, federal, state, and local, over $34 million annually. You need to be very cognizant of outlet density because once it gets out of control, it's very hard to rein it back in. Licensing is the foundation of all municipal alcohol policy. Now, as you can see from this chart, the, the blocks at the top that are in black, those are in fact what's required by the state. The application, publication in the paper, a public meeting, and then a decision has to be communicated to the licensee. That's what the state requires. But the blocks in gray below it indicate additional steps that an community can require or additional documentation the community can require. They probably don't want to require all of this or take all of these steps. It all depends on the particular alcohol environment, the goals that community has when building its alcohol environment. This chart's available on the Wisconsin Alcohol Policy website. Feel free to download it and use it when you look at the alcohol licensing policies of communities in your area. You can create guidelines that allow you to create the alcohol environment you want. One community decided it has its goal in its master plan. They want to be the family friendliest community in Dane County. And so they created guidelines and they follow them to guide their award of alcohol licensing. They follow guidelines, uh, the licenses that are awarded while following your local guidelines, they're inherently not arbitrary. They're going to be very hard to challenge in court. And having guidelines and developing those guidelines allows you to also develop a mapping strategy to identify emerging clusters and overconcentrations of alcohol outlets before they become very expensive community problems. You could create and stick with your quotas for each specific type of license. It's important to realize, though, the CDC has not set hard numerical targets. Right now, the number of variables is proximity to other areas that, in fact, it would be difficult to establish meaningful numerical goals. But that doesn't mean your community can't. You can decide how many alcohol outlets or the distance between outlets or the difference in where you want to locate outlets in business areas and residential areas. Create guidelines that reflect the community you want to create and then stick to them. To reflect those guidelines, you're probably going to want some additional information too. Now, the two forms you see on the screen are the forms that are provided by the state. Some communities just hand out the straight form direct from the Department of Revenue. Others like to print it off on their letterhead. Makes no difference. But more and more communities are finding what the state requires is not what allows them to award licenses based on their goals. And it doesn't really allow them to know exactly what that applicant has planned for his license. So they require a business plan. Has the applicant thought through how he's going to operate this location? What's his promotion plan? It's not in addition to whether or not he has one. If he's advertising, he's going to depend on a lot of business for nickel beer night, and this licensee would be in the middle of a residential area. You folks, as members of the city council, should know that in advance. You want to know what the estimated maximum occupancy will be. There's a very specific reason for that, because clubs and bars and restaurants are all licensed very similarly in Wisconsin. They're all Class B licenses. A place that's licensed as a restaurant, once the kitchen is closed, they can bring in a DJ and turn into a club. So they could tell you that this is going to be a restaurant with 75 tables serving until 9 o'clock at night. But if after 9 o'clock at night they turned it into a disco that had 300, if the building inspector or fire inspector said the occupancy of 300 was allowable, they wouldn't be in violation of their license. It's called morphing. It happens more frequently than many of us realize. For a large location, you might want a security plan. It pays to see the floor plan or rendering of every proposed licensee, because actually bar design has a lot to do with whether or not there's going to be outbreaks of violence in those areas. It's a whole field of study. And then finally, the menu. If someone says it's a restaurant, but all they've got is pizza and a microwave, chances are it's going to be operating more like a bar. And you need to know that before you award the license. Remember, there's no right for any information you need to award licenses that move you closer to the alcohol environment you want in your community. If you have guidelines, it also supports very thorough discussions. Let me give you some examples. All Class A licensees by law are allowed to hold alcohol tasting events. You cannot preempt them with an ordinance. Rather, the legislature has preempted you from passing an ordinance banning them. But you could ask each new Class A licensee to add a condition that they would not hold alcohol tasting events if they sold gasoline at that location. What about locations near high schools? If it was near a high school, maybe you don't want certain types of beverages there. Maybe you want the alcohol to be in a separate cabinet from the non-alcohol beverages so you can see where the high school kids are wandering. You can make it a license condition, and it can be part of your guidelines. You don't want any Class A licensees that sell gasoline also selling alcohol. You don't want any Class A licensees that are within X distance of the high school selling single serving containers of alcohol, or whatever you think limitations need to be put on that. These are your guidelines. You should create them to minimize the impact on nearby businesses and residences. Some communities decide to have a panel or a committee conduct the initial review of an application. That makes a lot of sense. When an applicant goes before the full council, I've seen situations where they've already advertised their grand opening date, and it puts unfair pressure on the council. Everybody's there. You may not have thorough discussion or review at that point. When you have a committee, then they can get down into the nitty-gritty, and they have the time to look at all aspects of that licensee and how they're going to impact the community. There's no requirement that you have a committee, and there's no state requirement on who has to be on that committee. The committee also would have the time to take neighborhood comment and then recommend specific license conditions. And I'll discuss those in depth in a minute, that would address very narrow individual license conditions that address small problems that it may not be appropriate to handle with an ordinance, but still creating accountability by that licensee. There's no requirement as to how many people will have to be on a committee. You create one based on what you want to accomplish. Some communities want to have a representative of the alcohol community, alcohol or hospitality industry on the committee. Many others, most in fact, don't. It's totally up to you. When you review that application, that's when your guidelines really matter. About 8 years ago, the Village of Oregon in southern Dane County adopted guidelines, and they have stuck to them. This is what they look at. They look at the history of the premises. Was it a problematic location before? Proximity to other licensed establishments. The impact on nearby property values. This is increasingly something that aldermen are looking at. There was a situation in Wausau a few years ago where one bar was totally out of control. It took close to a year to get revoke that license, and in the interim, the homes in the immediate area were basically unsaleable. That made people realize, a lot of us realize, that the impact on local property values is something important to consider. The ability of the police department to ensure public safety at this location. That deals with parking, but it also deals with the amount of money and time that you've dedicated to your police force now. If the police department doesn't have the ability to provide security services to this location or an establishment of this size, unless you hire more police or get an extra unit on, that is a legitimate reason for denying the application. The management experience of the applicant, the proposed business plan, overall outlet density. Oregon has always been very sensitive to that, and then the proximity to the schools. One of their goals in rewriting their overall alcohol policies for that community was to prevent and reduce underage drinking. They saw a spike over a couple of years, and they took it to heart and decided they were taking steps to bring that rate down, and they have very successfully. So they develop these guidelines, but more importantly, they stick to them. When you're also working on licensed premises, it's important to define the section that says what is the licensed premises type, well defined. Until a few years ago, it was just a line, and it looked like you were supposed to write in the address or location of the proposed licensee, and that's what most folks did. But the consequence of that was that the entire building was then licensed for the sale, serving, storage of alcohol. Now, as people have wanted more space to really come up with tight definitions, they have redesigned the form so that you can say 250 square feet emanating from the northwest wall, comprising no more than one refrigerated case and 150 shelf feet, or a room on the side, or as you have in Janesville, the separate area that has to be centered with the solid wall between them. Keeping your licensed premises well defined in Class B as well as Class A is very, very important. If someone has a basement and they say, no, we're just going to use it for storage now, you don't want that included. Well, you would probably want it for purposes of storage included in the licensed premises, but they couldn't have people down there. If you want to limit the locations within a building that can store or be used as sales space, then you need to keep the definition of the licensed premises very, very tight. They can always come back to you and ask for more. Most of us in Wisconsin have seen a couple of things. You fill up your gas tank, and then you go into what you thought was a convenience store, and it really looks a lot more like a liquor store with gas pumps in front. That's what happens when the licensed premises definition is not kept tight. Or you go into a grocery store with your kids and you find stacks of beer next to bicycles, and you find alcohol for sale at a counter that's right across from the breakfast cereal. That is also the result of a licensed premises that was not kept tight. I know you have special restrictions in Janesville, but the fact of the matter is it's important to keep those. And if you work in another community nearby, it's important to realize keeping the licensed premises description well defined is one of the strongest tools you have in your toolbox for making sure that this licensee is in fact who he says he's going to be. Recently, because of click and collect, some licensees have been coming back and asking for certain parking spots to be included in their licensed premises so that they can sell alcohol and deliver it to people in the car. It's important to realize that when you do that, you also authorize alcohol tasting events in those specific parking spaces. It's never as straightforward as it may seem. That's why keeping the licensed premises area tight and well-defined makes a lot of sense. And then there are the picnic licenses, Class B temporary licenses. They can only go to bona fide civic chamber groups, like Chamber of Commerce, community groups, veterans. They don't have to be a 501c3, but they do need to be around for about 6 months. You can only get them for beer and wine, no spirits, and they're usually for a time limited. We know the best practices for operating a festival or a beer tent in Wisconsin, and you can make them license conditions. Research conducted at the University of Minnesota indicated that the two most likely problems at a festival or an outdoor event were one, underage drinking, and two, overserving. They then defined these 4 practices and 7 policies on the slide that will prevent and reduce these from happening. A few years later, a group out of La Crosse retested these 4 and 7 policies, confirmed that they work in Wisconsin, but they also had additional items that were very important, and that was because the leadership of these groups turns over so rapidly, it's important to make them license conditions. These are groups that, in many cases, are doing great community service, and they're raising money for the programs for kids, the rec services, and the wonderful things they do in the community. These are not professional alcohol control people. So it's important that they understand how important it is that they sell and serve alcohol responsibly. And these 4 practices and policies, when attached to the license as license conditions, it means you don't meet these guidelines, and next year we may not give you your license. In La Crosse, they don't make them license conditions yet. They are handing them out as individual, as a sheet that gets handed when you get your alcohol license. Would like you to do take these additional steps. As several of you may have heard, this is now a feline assisted presentation. So if you would like to know more about the outdoor event and festival policy, there's a full page on the Wisconsin Alcohol Policy Project website. You can find an observational survey you can use in your community, the key to score it, a more detailed description of how La Crosse went about testing these and what they do with them. Going back to this chart for one more second, you will see that that is license conditions. This is where they come in. License conditions are allowed from the broad authority given to communities under their authority to issue license as they, quote, deem proper. They fall into three general categories: restrictions on the physical property, restrictions on the operation of the licensee, and security restrictions or requirements. About 5 years ago, I did a survey of over 40 licensees in Wisconsin and licensed over 40 communities in Wisconsin to determine the restrictions they placed on the specific licensees. These are all specific license conditions that were adopted in Wisconsin by licensees. These aren't hypothetical or something I've pulled from another state. Some of the ones for security were video cameras at specific locations, require an ID check at the door, in other words, that people couldn't get in without showing an ID, making the licensee responsible for maintaining order at the door, barring bar patrons who are involved in a fight from that location for a specific period of time. On Class A licensees, well, as I mentioned before, they agree not to hold any alcohol beverage tasting. Another one is you could have them agree to remove any product from the shelves immediately at the request of police. There's a specific reason for this. Unlike most other states, or many other states, Wisconsin does not review alcohol products before they're sold or served in Wisconsin. It wasn't an issue when it was basically canned beer, bottled beer, or pony barrels, and brown spirits and clear spirits. But now there are pre-made Jello shots. There are lots of different varieties of hard waters and teas, and many of them are very attractive to children. Several groups, including groups here in Rock County, objected to Emadka, which was a bottle of vodka that was shaped like a small rubber toy. It took us over a year to get that off the shelves in Wisconsin. But a license condition would allow the police, if they found a product that they just felt was dangerous, they could go in and say, hey, would you take this off the shelves? You can ask them to say they won't sell single servings of alcohol if they sell gasoline or if they're near a high school. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. Not many people believe that someone fills the tank with gas and buys a single can of beer or 160-ounce to take it home and put in the refrigerator. It's an anti-drunk driving prevention method. And you could also require them to keep the coolers separate for the alcohol beverages. In Class B licensees, as I said earlier, the goal is to address those very small requirements, those very small issues that can be an issue for that location, but maybe not elsewhere in the city. It would be inappropriate to adopt an ordinance, but you can make that licensee responsible for it. For example, no speakers on the interior balcony. The sound might carry outside. One licensee, they had to have the sound exterior on the exterior TV. They had an area outside and they had a TV there. Well, now they're required to mute it after a specific hour. Why? Because they're in a residential neighborhood. Smokers were encouraged to smoke in front of the building because when they smoked outside in the back parking lot, they were near a residential area and their voices carried. Some places require a responsible beverage plan. In some theaters, they've limited alcohol availability to special events and not films. They had special hours they could be there. There's a no noise agreement for taking out trash, especially for licensees, Class B licensees in a residential area. This is a big issue. A bar closes at 2 a.m., especially on the weekend. If that dumpster backs up next to your 2-year-old's room, you do not want them dumping all their bottles in the recycling at 2 a.m. I once lived next door to the Great Dane, 8 floors up, and I could still hear every time they put their bottles out after hours. It gave me new appreciation for that license condition. And then several communities require annual meetings with the neighbors if there have been problems at that location in the past. Security arrangements. Again, it may not be appropriate for everyone in the city, but if there are locations that have been problematic, if a new licensee comes in, you can put these on their license. If they really want that license, they will agree to have a licensed security firm. They will call the police if they think there's a crime occurring or if they believe a crime will be occurring. They will have a video camera and they will keep that tape for 10 days and make it available to the police. These sorts of things for a bar that has been problematic in the past, putting them on as license conditions for a new applicant isn't convicting those new applicants, but it is addressing the concerns your constituents are likely to have. And it can save you a lot of problems in the long run and late night phone calls. There are many, many possible reasons that you can deny a license. One of them is the most obvious. There are sufficient outlets in this community already there to award alcohol license to serve the needs of the community. You just don't need another bar. I've seen police chief very cagily say things like, well, let's see. We've got a location selling alcohol on 3 of the 4 corners of that major intersection. Do you really think we need a 4th? Well, of course you don't. They're concerned about a cluster occurring, and they should be. Police objections. Sometimes people fail the background check, or maybe if they owned a bar elsewhere, they got a negative police report from the police chief in that community. Neighborhood objections is a perfectly legitimate reason to deny an applicant, as are traffic and parking concerns. Parking concerns, if you do not enough parking nearby and people are parking in a residential area, often if over-serving becomes an issue, you're going to have litter, you're going to have noise, you're going to have public urination. And then, of course, a negative background check on the applicant is, of course, always a good reason to deny an application. Revocation and non-renewal are actually fairly similar in Wisconsin. If you want to non-renew your license, and we're coming up on renewal now, so you're probably in the thick of this right now, but non-renewal needs to begin several months before the final vote on renewal. Like revocation, you need to build the record. Have they violated municipal regulations that match Chapter 125 or aspects of state law? Do they keep or maintain a disorderly, riot, decent, or improper house? That has nothing to do with prostitution. What it can mean is, are there a lot of fights there that get out into the street? Is it disturbing the peace? The language about having given away or sold alcohol to habitual known drunkards, that is statutory. It's there, but I've never seen it used. Does not possess the qualification required to hold the license. They may not be residents of Wisconsin. Sometimes mom and dad retired to another location. The kids run the bar, but the parents might not even be Wisconsin residents anymore. Longtime licensees are going to know they can't transfer that license to their children. Their children would be a new applicant. They may feel they don't want to let go, or maybe they're concerned you would not approve that application. But if they're not a resident of Wisconsin anymore, they no longer possess the qualifications to hold that license. And then once again, if anyone has been involved or that location has been involved in the manufacture, distribution, or selling of controlled substances, i.e. it's a drug spot, you want to revoke that license. There are actually a lot of resources for people who are in a local leadership position, whether it's a member of the city council, a senior municipal official, or someone who wants to be actively involved for any reason in alcohol licensing in their community. The Wisconsin League of Municipalities puts out a fantastic book on licensing and regulation of alcohol. It doesn't deal with the whys, but it's very deep on the hows. You can purchase it for yourself at the website of the Wisconsin League of Municipalities for $20, or I would be happy to send you copies if you'll put your name and address in the chat box with the understanding that I can't get into the law school right now, and this is where my mailing supplies and those books are located. So once I can return to campus, I would be delighted to send you a copy of this book. It was revised just a couple of years ago. I also hope you will consider the Wisconsin Alcohol Policy Project and our website, a resource you can use repeatedly, because we cover the issues that licensees face, but also issues the community is facing from the perspective of the community. And feel free to reach out to me at any point if you have questions or there are topics you think I should be covering that I haven't. You will also find a series of infographics that help cover some of the basic interventions and policies and practices your community can adopt to create a more positive alcohol environment. Alcohol will always carry risk. The goal is to have the lowest possible risk, to minimize the risk to your community, to community government, but most of all, to the residents and people who live and work there. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box. And I think Erin's going to forward them to me, right, Erin?
Yes, so we've had a request for the slides to be sent out to me so that I can email them to people who joined us today.
I would be happy to do that. I'll put them in a PDF form and send them to you, Erin, if you'll share them.
Okay, great. And then I have a question from Dave Godak asking, can you please clarify what you mean when you say a business owner must live in the state?
No, I said be a resident of. There are lots of people that are residents of Wisconsin that don't live here 12 months a year. And it's not the business owner, it's the licensee. So I know the terms get a little commingled here, but it doesn't need to be the guy that owns the building. The building might be rented. The person that signed the applicant, I am the licensee, unless it's a corporation, needs to be a resident of Wisconsin. Many communities require a local agent, so there's someone nearby that they can contact. You don't have to be a resident of that community, but you probably have to have an agent within the community, but you need to be a resident of Wisconsin.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Does that clarify the question?
Unless, of course, you want to turn it into a corporation or a partnership, and that's all covered. I mean, it doesn't mean mom and dad have to move back to Wisconsin. There are legal alternatives to being an individual licensee, but in many cases, it will require you to reapply as a new applicant, and often people wish to avoid that.
Thank you, Julia. Do we have any further questions from our audience? I am not seeing any. You were very thorough, Julia. I appreciate that.
Well, I'm happy to do it. Oh, I think I heard someone say they had a question. No, it was just feedback. All right, then. Thank you very much, everyone. My email address is there. That phone number, I check that email from phone from time to time, but obviously I don't have access to it right now. So please, if you have a follow-up question, send it to me via email and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a wonderful day.